We did it. We made a podcast. Me and old Leo DiSanto sat down and we had ourselves a conversation, and we had that conversation into microphones with headphones on, and that's podcasting. So don't come at me saying you didn't make a podcast. Unfortunately, there is no video elements to this episode, and honestly, I really don't know if that's going to be a thing. We're going to see how I feel about video editing. Like I said, I'm learning as I go, and I'm super grateful for all of the encouragement and support that I've gotten so far. And I'm going against what a lot of people have told me thus far. A lot of folks have told me that I should release a very abridged version of this and upload the full version on a Patreon behind a paywall. And I'm kind of treating this like your first taste. I'm going to give it, this one's free. And I really hope that you get just so hopelessly addicted to this kind of conversation that you keep coming back for more. And honestly, I don't have anything else. I don't have anything else lined up. I don't have anything recorded. I don't have a backlog of material. I'm just so excited to get this out. And maybe this is a mistake. Maybe I shouldn't do this soon, but hell with it. I'm so proud. So I hope you enjoy this. Without any further ado, this is Mr. Leo DiSanto, everybody.
Getting stoned in his basement, and now he's just like a stoned dummy in a much bigger space with lots of money.
Yeah, I did happen to notice that there's a distinct lack of cannabis and basement. But
yeah, it's true. There's probably some cannabis around here somewhere. I haven't used any in years, but it doesn't mean that there's not some in one of these boxes somewhere.
Right. I'm sure actually now that I think about it, I think I've been using cannabis long enough to have like mystery stashes of cannabis.
I do, for sure.
There's somewhere.
Because I used to use it in a kind of medicinal way, particularly after I stopped drinking, but it just kind of stopped being medicinal, or rather I stopped feeling like I needed medicine.
Right, yeah.
Like the reframing that I was using it for, like the kind of mental reframing that I was using it for to adjust moods and stuff just kind of became possible. I learned the trick.
Yeah.
So I didn't need the chemical anymore. But
I'm not there yet.
Well, I'm sure it's different for everybody as to whether there is a there. Like
right.
Some people use antidepressant medication and stuff, which I have experimented with in the past, and I don't find it helpful. But some people say they really, really do, and cool,
right,
whatever it takes,
right.
This shit's hard. So
I do think it requires that sort of level of self-honesty where you do pause and ask, like, what am I actually trying to accomplish?
Yeah, that's right. I think that is important because it's easy for something that's actually maybe not a healthy habit to kind of masquerade as something that is.
Yeah.
And I think part of that becomes like how much do I need this, and like definitely my relationship with coffee may not be healthy because I'm really challenged to function without it, but
yeah.
I only have like a cup or a cup and a half, or maybe 2 cups
at a
day,
time.
so,
right.
So like you also have to consider like the detriment factor. Like
for sure,
there's really not one with coffee because it's actually considered to be healthy for you and in that kind of quantity. So and cannabis, as far as we know, in moderate quantities, I don't think it's too bad for people with grown brains to use
right.
it,
I mean, I would be hard pressed to have anyone convince me that it's perfectly fine to inhale burning plant matter on a regular basis.
No, I don't
think
so. I think we know it's not.
Right.
But there's so many delivery methods now.
Yeah.
The delivery technology keeps getting more and more sophisticated. So.
Yeah. Breathing in the smoke reminds me that I'm not currently working on a fire, which is nice.
Yeah. That's a whole other twist on it,
Yeah.
That's a whole other wrinkle.
So I will dive in.
Yeah.
I've got believe it or not, I do have a couple friends that don't already know who you are. So I do want to...
I'd say that's the majority of the world, the vast majority of the population in any given area. But.
For sure. As far as the 8 billion people on planet Earth are concerned.
Or even in this town, this is a small neighborhood, but I bet if you polled the electorate, most of them would have no idea who I am. Oh, it's that guy with the dogs who yells at his dogs sometimes.
Yeah.
And, you know,
It's the busted up van and shit like that.
Every now and again, he just starts letting expletives fly through the air for no apparent reason. But then again, this is Washington Borough, you know, sudden bouts of gunfire or the sound of failing car engines and expletives. It's all par for the course.
Right.
You know?
It's part of the
down
scenery.
here by the river, you know. But I digress.
Van by the river.
I digress, as a man with a microphone so often does.
As is the custom. So you've categorized yourself as a song and story man.
Yeah.
Storyman.
It was kind of like going for the old like song and dance man thing, except that I really have no business calling myself a dance man. But I do tell a lot of stories.
For sure.
So song and story man. It's kind of like a song and dance man, only you're doing the dance with just like your tongue and your neural synapses.
Yeah, it's all just different ways of telling stories.
Yeah, I mean, you know, neural synapses are involved in the leg kind of dancing too. It's just that my legs don't necessarily want to do the thing. So,
right.
You know, maybe one of these days I'll take some lessons. I've always admired those people who can just go out on the floor and kind of tear it up.
Just cut it up. Yeah, man.
Sometimes people come to shows and they just go out and they start just like killing it. I'm like, man.
I'm terrified. I'm like, you know, confessional hour in 2 heads inside of a bucket. I'm super self-conscious about dancing.
Yeah.
And if there's a mic stand in front of me, if there's some sort of barrier between me and an audience, like I dance quite a bit on stage.
That's interesting because I'm the same way. Yeah, I'll dance on stage, but yeah, I feel like if you're doing something else to kind of like validate yourself too. You know,
right.
You've got the microphone, you're singing, there's a performance going on. If all that there is the dancing, then I fear that I'm not going to make the cut. So it's just like, you know, I did invent a dance once. It's called the plunger. It's like, you know, it's really good for like plotting music that has a kind of a boom, 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 boom. Tom Waits is great for the plunger, but like it's like you stick a plunger to your head and then down, up, like the, you know, like just kind of like bend at the knees, and I've been trying to get it to catch on for a long time, and it seems like its time hasn't quite arrived yet. I don't know.
Well, this is the first time that I've been really bummed that I don't have a video element to this particular interview, but
yeah, because I'd get up and do it then,
right,
if we did.
and you have to, and that would be
demonstrate. But you know, I'll just offer, you know, if this part of the dialogue makes it into the podcast for some reason, and anyone wants to learn the plunger, you have only to ask. You know, I'll happily give lessons. I
don't know why you think that this is not.
This sounds like the kind of thing that would be in a podcast.
Right. You know? That being said, though, I suppose song and story are sort of under the same umbrella, or maybe song is under the same umbrella of story. But why is it that stories are important?
Well, our whole lives are made of stories, you know, like I mean, that's not necessarily obvious to people in like as radical of a way as I mean it, but like I really mean like the idea that there's two guys sitting in a room talking on microphones in a world orbiting a sun, and like all of that stuff is a story, and it's one of other possible stories, and like, you know, either that's going to sound like bullshit to you, or you'll think, you know, and by you I mean the general you, anyone who might be hearing
the royal you,
or else the royal you, exactly. Or else you'll think like maybe there's something to that, but you know, that's to say something's a story is not to say that that it doesn't correspond to some reality in some way. It just means that it's like, you know, a way of framing a reality in language, maybe, or a way of sketching a reality in language. And you know, as we all know, like the way that what stories we tell about things, there goes our view of the world, right, or our view of our lives. So if I have a story where I'm a terrible piece of shit and I'm not much use to anyone and the world's a bleak place, you know, holding my terrible carcass until it departs and goes underground, then I'll have one view of the world, whereas like if the world revolves around me and I'm super important, I'll have another view of the world, maybe not that much of a more beneficial one for other people. Neither of those views might benefit others too much. Whereas if I have a view of the world where, you know, life is just lifing all over the place and I'm a part of that process, and, you know, like kind of a part of the great community of life. There's a lot of different framings for things, big and small, you know, and I'm really in danger of like derailing here and going off on some long tangent, which I'll try to avoid, and just say that, you know, I think stories are that fundamental to our reality, and like they for humans, for creatures that deal in concepts and words and language the way that we do, stories really kind of are a version of our reality, you know? So,
yeah.
So it's important. And obviously the tie-in with music is, you know, not all forms of music is story based, you know, like classical music might suggest a story. It might have been written to suggest a story. And so I'm not going to say that music has to have language or words to have a story to it. But I kind of count myself as a member of the folk music tradition, just because, you know, it's the people's music. You know, we're not necessarily all virtuoso players or anything, but, you know, we travel around. We usually have some stains on our shirts. We tell stories a lot. It's, you know, kind of that sort of grassroots tradition of like folk music, which I think I count rock and roll as being sort of adjacent and related to that. And so, yeah. And also increasingly, as might already be obvious from this conversation, I have tended towards like a rambling style of performing. And that wasn't always the case. I mean, I guess it was always kind of the case, but it started to cohere a little bit more, to the point where on stage now, I often will tell stories that are kind of part of the show, that are not just like, you know, kind of offhanded. Like some performers, that's not part of their show. They'll talk to the audience a little, or they won't. Like I saw Bob Dylan last year, and he didn't say a word the entire time. Right. He would just kind of like waddle out from behind his keyboard and stand there like a gunslinger for a minute, facing down the audience. Then he'd go back behind the keyboard and, you know, and play again. And he didn't say anything until he introduced the band, which is funny because like, musically, Bob Dylan's probably considered one of the great storytellers of all time.
Yeah,
but he doesn't do it. He doesn't do it in that manner. So,
I guess he kind of has gotten to a point that he can do literally whatever he wants on stage and still sell every single ticket.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and you know, you can't say that he hasn't made his contribution.
Right.
He's made as much of a contribution as anyone ever has.
There's
to an art form.
There's that trope about like, particularly dead musicians, where people will say it's such a tragedy and they had so much more to give.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was pretty arrogant to say, like, maybe they were done.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it is presumptuous. Although I've been tempted to wonder the same thing. I mean, like Buddy Holly was 24 when he died, and his songwriting and his guitar playing were so brilliant, from what I can hear, that one does wonder, because, you know, we were deprived of like the 40-year-old Buddy Holly.
For sure.
How different is your perspective now than it was at 25, and it'll be different than that at 45 or 55. You know, mine certainly is. You know, the kind of the things that it seems, the way that I want to communicate in music, or the way that I'm moved to communicate, and the things that I'm moved to communicate about are so different that I can't help but wonder, like, if Buddy Holly would have lived, or, you know, like what would John Lennon have been doing? But, you know,
State Farm commercials.
Of course, like I'm not a big good Lord. I mean, there are some bands that sound to me like all their music is written to be in commercials, but I'm not going to go talking trash on them. My days of being a hater are long over, folks. I'm no hate. Rising tide lifts all boats. Support each other. You know, support your other artists. And
I'm trying to get there, but God, it's so fun to hate.
Oh, I know. It's a dig. It's like, you know, so many of the things that you shouldn't just, like, you know, it's like anyone who's ever drank, like, sat there and just drank a whole 6-pack of beer. It's like, you know, it might not be the thing that is the best idea for what you should be doing right now, but it just feels good, and then it leads to places that don't feel so good. And that's how hating is too.
You never meet someone who's like smoking a cigarette who's surprised to learn that cigarette smoking is bad.
No,
for
not
them.
these
It's
days.
Like, you know what you're
Wait,
doing.
what?
Get the fuck out of here, really?
These things?
I thought it's a vegetable, you know? So in kind of getting into some pretty dense weeds of the way that my brain works, and this really is just
I love
curiosity. Brain weeds, man.
I love exploring brain weeds. It's my favorite.
In my experience, people that have away with words sometimes struggle with pure experience, much in the same way that sometimes someone would have a difficult time putting experience into words after the fact.
That's interesting.
And when I say people and my experience, I'm talking about me, where a lot of times I'll find myself actually struggling to just experience something instead of
narrating it.
Yeah, I just get it in my head and I'm like, oh, I'm just in the act of codifying this into words so that I can tell about it later.
Oh yeah.
So I'm wondering, is that a motivating factor in the travel and the wanderlust? Is it seeking out experience for the sake of experience, or is it maybe a challenge to seek out experience in order to codify them into words and stories?
That's changed a lot in the past few years. And I've come to realize that so much of my far-flung traveling was like in search of that story and that narrative. Like I wasn't searching, I would have told you I was searching for the pure experience, but really like I wanted to tell about these adventures, like and that's not inherently bad. Like it's great to go have adventures and bring back stories. We do that and we inspire each other that way. And, we kind of push the horizon of possibility back for other people and for ourselves that way. But I do feel like I might have missed out on a lot of that experiential element. And it wasn't until, my meditation practice became rather, much deeper that I began to realize this, because then you're just sitting there watching the narrative about the meditation, unfolding.
Yeah.
But then eventually you notice that that's what you're doing, and you notice you're doing it with everything, I often wonder how many people this is the case for. I heard somewhere that a certain percentage, and it's like a surprisingly large percentage of people report not having an internal narrator voice.
Yeah.
And I'm very skeptical. Now, maybe this is true, but I'm very skeptical. I would challenge that person to attend a weekend meditation retreat where they're like forced to sit there quietly for hours on end and try to, focus on something or have open awareness or whatever it is, the technique, and then tell me that there's not thoughts or there's not a voice. Because I've even talked to a few people who made this claim, and when I pressed just a little bit, they were like, okay, you know what, maybe it's just that I don't really notice that, they when they reflected a little bit, even then it became clear to them that maybe what they were saying about not having thoughts, that their mind was usually empty, is because I think it's very rare. I feel like,
for sure,
as creatures that evolve learning language, I mean, I was a linguistics student in college, and we studied a lot about language acquisition, and like a child, like a baby, starts learning language so quickly. By the time they're like, the reason that Noam Chomsky gave for asserting that language is a native capacity that humans have is that for a small child to learn these complex grammatical formations at the rate that they do would be akin to a child of that age learning like complex calculus, like the rules of grammar and grammar transformation are that intricate when you break them apart and study them, and yet it's just something that we effortlessly acquire, and it can be any language. You can drop that kid in Japan and it'll be Japanese. You can take him a couple of years later, over to Italy and it'll be Italian, whatever. It's that intrinsic, that they believe that it's actually, they've identified parts of the brain that are responsible for language acquisition and language storage. So I feel like most of us live in this world that is really made of language far more than we realize.
Yeah.
And if you examine it, then you start to realize how much that's true. So
I've been going into some pretty deep rabbit holes about language and linguistics, particularly etymology lately. But like you said, there's just countless rules about stuff that kids fall into effortlessly. But I've also been fascinated by the things that aren't rules, but we all do anyway. And the example that I love is the order of adjectives, where, let's say a cute sleeping black dog is a matter of something broad and narrowing focus in, and it would make you understandably pause for a second if I said a sleeping cute dog brown.
Well,
there's an order to things.
Yeah, well, you're putting the adjective after the noun there, so that's
right.
usually the modifier comes before that, which it would modify.
Yeah, all right, I get it. You went to college for this. No, you're absolutely correct.
I can geek out on some linguistics. Yeah, there are things that are more like stylistic customs, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because even those things like sounds, different phonemic sounds of just speech, like whether you say caught or whatever, these
right.
variations actually travel across landscapes like weather patterns, based on the different ethnicities of groups that migrate to different areas. The sounds themselves migrate. So like we used to study like how whole papers have been written on how like one verbal expression or one phonemic variation has traveled across the country. Like, oh, now it's in Ohio, it's,
right.
It's so fascinating. And then there are these things that are thought just like the structure. And this is mostly, obviously it's not like vocabulary or and it's not even phonemics. It's like the grammar. I mean, I guess the phonemics are too. Yeah. Because the sounds come in a predictable sequence for a baby. Like they'll usually start learning certain sounds before other sounds. And they tend to do it in a similar way.
Yeah. I recently saw something about how it was a list of all these different languages that evolved independently from each other, but the word for mother was similar. And no way to test this or know it for sure, but it seems very likely to assume that that's just the way that things play out in the early, where ma is the easiest word or sound for a baby to make. It's one of the first ones. And so that becomes the root of the thing that they're probably calling for in the beginning. And when the baby says ma, the mother comes running. Sure. And
it brings a result. And then
right. And so then the kid is like,
conditioning kicks in, and
that's what that is.
Yeah.
We could spend the whole
thing on that. It's like there's so many. Conversation is a long and winding road full of many branches.
For sure. A story.
They almost all of them lead into the weeds.
So the title of the show is "Get Better and Die Trying."
Oh, nice! I didn't know that. That's cool.
Oh, I didn't tell you that.
You may have, but it just didn't make
stick.
It in. Yeah.
Yeah, Get Better and Die Trying. I figured I was going to put die right in the name so I could spare myself having to put a trigger warning at the beginning of every episode that we are talking about death. And you have cancer.
Yeah.
Would you tell us
a cancer?
Yeah, a cancer currently so far.
Only one so far that I know of, but there's always time to increase one's collection.
Would you be so kind as to give us just a brief description of your particular denomination of cancer?
Yeah, they didn't use. It's part of a group called myeloproliferative neoplasms, which neoplasm is the word for cancer, and these things didn't used to be considered cancers. They're blood disorders, and it involves the overproduction of one or more of the varieties of blood cells. So red, white, or usually not white, but red or platelet usually. And
did you almost say red, white, or blue?
Red, white, or platelet. Yeah. Okay. I guess platelets are blue.
Depending on what country you're in.
Yeah.
You might have some red,
These
white,
colors
blue
don't
blood
run.
cells.
These colors don't run unless the blood cells overproduce.
Unless you accidentally make a couple
in which
too
case
many.
They better. You got to get rid of some of them. Yeah. So I have a condition called polycythemia vera, where too many blood cells are produced, usually mostly like the red, the hemoglobin. So it puts you at increased risk of blood clots, which did happen to me once. It was like the first sign of it, but I didn't figure it out for years after that. The doctors just kind of said, well, we don't know why this happened. You're young and fit, and it doesn't usually, but sometimes it does, and probably won't again. And then later on, when things got weird and the diagnosis came in, that kind of explained it. But blood clots, particularly in the deep veins and stuff, of course, put you at great risk of strokes and
for sure
heart attacks. And there's also some other nasty things that can happen, like in the end stage of the disease, which, you know, who knows when that is, but they really kind of don't, you know, because like usually when people are diagnosed with it, they're in their 60s. So like for a 45-year-old, which is or I guess I was 44 when I was diagnosed, they didn't really know what to say. But, you know, in the end stage, all your bone marrow can turn to scar tissue, and then you just like, you know, as opposed to having too many blood cells, you have like none or not enough, and, you know, you can bleed to death. It can turn into leukemia, which can kill you. So, you know, it introduces a variety of interesting possibilities for one's death that you might not have thought of before, you know?
For sure.
But it's a very slow progressing cancer. So often, I don't know whether often is the right word, but it's entirely possible for someone to have it, and with treatment and management, which is minimally invasive, live a pretty full lifespan. So it's not like, you know, when people hear I have cancer, they often think like, oh, you know, the chemo, like you're going to fight this, you're going to beat it. And I'm like, you know, I don't know what that means exactly, because they're telling me that like this little monkey is going to ride along for the rest of my life. And, you know, there's not really any beating with it. It's like shaking hands with it and being friends with it. And just like, hey, there's a monkey, you know, like, don't leave your monkey food out on the table, you know, like put up a monkey proof fence in whatever parts of the house you can. And, so yeah, it's basically like I might die at any time, just like you or any of the listeners.
Right.
but you know, I have maybe a little bit more of an inkling how that might happen to me. Than some other people do.
And that's fair. And how, you said you're 45 now, you were 44 when you were diagnosed.
I'm 46, and it was almost 3 years ago now. Yeah.
How old are you now?
46.
You're 46.
Yeah. I was 44. It was the end of 2022, like just before Christmas. When
I'm still in that phase where I think of 2020 as last year.
Yeah, I know.
So
It really did kind of fuck our sense of chronology, didn't it?
Yeah. These are all stories that are very well documented in your casual memoir, Diary of a Reverse Vampire.
Yeah, one of these days I'm going to consolidate all the entries on my website, because right now they're just strewn about Facebook.
Right.
But you know, I've been really surprised and heartened by how people have responded to that, because you know, like we tend to push death and mortality off into a dark corner and not want to think about it, but people have really kind of like responded open-heartedly to these stories and poems that I've published under that title, Diary of a Reverse Vampire, which, you know, for the perplexed listener, refers to the fact that part of the treatment for my condition is that occasionally I have to donate a pint of blood to the incinerator because I have too many blood cells, right? So now I'm on a medication that I take every couple of weeks that just suppresses the blood cell production a little. But if the number, you know, they read my numbers like the stock market: buy low, sell high. And if things are too high, then they'll send me into the blood bank, and the nice ladies at the blood bank will take a pint off of me and lighten the load. And so, you know, I'm a reverse vampire. I need to get rid of blood to live.
Right.
So Diary of a Reverse Vampire, and yeah. What I usually write them when I'm sitting in the lobby at the cancer center, which is a favorite form of meditation of mine now. It's like a non-meditation. There's a kind of Buddhist meditation called metta, which is also known as loving kindness meditation, where the object of your meditation is the feeling of friendliness for yourself and other beings, sometimes individually, sometimes all together. And let me tell you, sitting in a cancer treatment center is a hypercharged source of that feeling, because you know, I'm in there, I walk in there under my own volition. I'm, you know, I could drop and do some push-ups. I'm like, a lot of people are not in that position. They're in there, they're in wheelchairs, they're hobbling on canes. I've seen people wheeled in there and on a bed. And so I'm always feeling fairly reflective when I'm sitting there. And, you know, I'm also often waiting for the results of a blood test that could reveal that things have gone suddenly sideways for me, and that my life is about to be very different or over or whatever.
Right.
So, that's usually when I write them, when I'm sitting there waiting to see my oncologist, and I come up with these little musings, and it's been really cool to see how one lady told me that her father wanted to draw he was an artist, and I had one of my entries was this poem called "The Monkey in the Rafters," kind of using that monkey metaphor I was just saying about knowing I have this thing, and she was like, he wants to paint that for you, and he wonders if that would be okay. And I was like, oh wow, I'm so touched by that. That's that this older man read this and was like connected to it enough that he wanted to make it into a piece of art for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's cool.
I'm very curious how that will turn out. Like, what
I
does it look like to him?
I haven't heard more, and it's been probably a year.
Okay.
So I don't know if it ever materialized, or the person who made the offer wasn't someone who I know. So
it's not like you can hunt them down and be like, "Where's my painting?"
Yeah, right.
You promised me a painting of a monkey in the
Whether
rafters.
it ever materializes or not, I was still equally touched by the fact that it was even a thought, that he would want to do that.
I have the first thought that came to my mind as a product of my generation is the evil monkey from Family Guy.
I remember that. Yeah. That was I wasn't a huge fan of that show, but I always laughed my ass off at that monkey.
For sure. Yeah.
Just like pointing intensely.
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways.
I think of mine a little bit like that, except I don't think of him as being evil. It's funny because people always say like, fuck cancer and cancer sucks. And I get that. Like, it's killing your family members but cancer isn't a person, it doesn't have intent. It's just like something that cells are doing. The same might be said of people, but like we're going to get into a whole like free will determinism thing there. So I won't go too far down that road, but like, ask yourself if a hurricane is an evil thing or a flood or, whatever it is. And cancer is like that. It's something that cells do. So like, I don't ever say like, fuck my cancer. I believe in kind of this sort of peace. It's like, all right, well, you're here. Hi, I'm Leo. I'm the guy you're maybe going to kill. Let's get on with it. Let's get on with the show.
I've got this thing I have to go to. You want to come?
Yeah. You coming along?
This, again, something I don't know outside of research. Were you raised in any particular faith or doctrine?
No, I wasn't. Nominally Roman Catholic. My grandparents were Italian. My grandfather was from Italy, so that was pretty important to them. But
I thought Leo DiSanto was a strong Irish name.
Yeah, right. Mick DiSanto. It didn't really translate to my dad. So like there was an attempt, like I was baptized or not baptized, christened. I guess that's like baptism when you're a baby.
Yeah.
See, I don't even know what I'm talking about. I'm like Catholic illiterate. And we went to a Catholic church for the first few years of my life, but it just dropped off and we didn't go to any church. And, at the end of my father's life, they asked him like, do you consider yourself as having any faith? Can we get anyone? And he was like, no. I remember him telling me a few times that he considered himself a deist, and he always referenced the founding fathers of America. He's like Thomas Jefferson, I was like, what does that mean, Dad? And he said, well, I think there was some kind of a God, and he, basically the watchmaker theory, like God created the world and then just said, all right, there's that.
Yeah.
Go do something else now. Just kind of set it in motion and then walked away.
100%.
Okay, you talking monkeys. Don't do anything I wouldn't do.
I'll be back. Maybe. No, it's very interesting you bring that up because I started writing this this piece that started as just a purely practical thing that I intended to do, where I came up with definitions of words that I use quite often, and they're charged words, let's say, have a lot of baggage in my own experience and certainly in a lot of other people's experience, but to ask about the word God.
Yeah.
And, you ask 10 different people, you'll get 20 different answers
Sure.
about what God means.
Yeah.
And I have that written down.
Annie Lamott said, I think it was Annie Lamott. I hope I'm not misquoting her, but I'm 90% sure. She said, God is the worst nickname ever. Yeah. And she's very religious too. She's, she's very much into Jesus. And, but I love that quote.
Yeah.
I kind of agree. That's sort of how I feel about the word too.
There was a Pete Holmes from, I don't think it was his last special, his second to most recent special. He described meeting the tour manager for AC/DC, who said that God is the name for the blanket that we throw over the mystery to give it a shape.
Yeah,
and
I think that's great.
I loved it, and it really, there was some sort of resentment that bubbled up, and I had to sit with that for a second. Like, where's that coming from? And ultimately, it came from like, why couldn't I have gotten that definition early on? Because I think that's a beautiful thing.
I think that's great. Yeah,
just to say, like, don't put too much weight into that 3-letter word. It's just a placeholder for this thing that we literally can't talk about. That's why they say it's ineffable.
It's already an attempt to begin conceptualizing it as a being who presumably exists in opposition to other, like he's not, if there's something that is God, then there are things that are not God, maybe.
Yeah.
But maybe not. If you ask some people, they'll say everything is. The Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, who's been a very meaningful teacher in my life and probably millions of other people too.
At least a few.
He said to ask whether God, to talk about the existence or non-existence of God, is not consistent with the absolute, because the existence and non-existence are opposing concepts.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about the absolute, it would encompass both of those concepts and neither of them, so like to say God exists or doesn't exist. And I've always kind of felt similarly to that, although I didn't have such a way to put it into words. But when I often feel that atheists or professed atheists, depending on what you mean, because people even mean different things by that. Sometimes they kind of mean agnostic, or they mean, they're spiritual, but they don't believe in a supreme being.
Yeah.
But, people who are like, oh, there is no God, science shows it. Like, where does science show that? Like to believe to feel certain about the non-existence of some, like the source of all being. It's like, is just as arrogant and hubristic and kind of short-sighted, I think.
For sure.
Well, everything is coming out of something or nothing, or
right. Everything is
like, and I feel that that's one issue with scientism, is that it kind of, and by that I mean kind of the religiosity of science.
Yeah.
That some people, now don't get me wrong, I'm not a science denier or anything like that. I love science. I read science books all the time. I'm fascinated by it. It greatly enriches my spiritual practice, more than many spiritual texts have.
For
just
sure.
Knowing how absolutely weird and fascinating. I mean, physicists these days are becoming pretty convinced that like space-time is not fundamental, that it's just like something that emerges from like our consciousness of the world, and that there's actually some deeper. I mean, if that's not some shit, that gets you, touching in with the ground of being, I don't know what is. But yeah, I don't like the kind of narrow scientism that says, well, we already have it mostly figured out. There's just a few more pieces, and God's not part of it, and rebirth isn't part of it, and there's no continuation of anything after you die. It's like, it's totally the only really acceptable position on this, in my opinion, is like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because you don't. You don't know. Like, we know that our consciousness of this reality is created by our minds. That's just cutting edge neuroscience. Like, this is, in the words of the neuroscientist Anil Seth, who got it from somewhere else, and this is a controlled hallucination. Like, us talking in a room full of objects with colors which don't actually exist in the world. They're just a product of our nervous systems meeting whatever light waves might actually be. You don't know what's going on, so don't pretend that you do.
No, I recently started to have a bit of an issue with the watchmaker metaphor, in that if you find a watch that implies a watchmaker, and then like bango presto, that means there's a God.
Yeah.
But that still implies that the watch and the watchmaker are two different things.
Sure.
And
it's also circular in a way, I think, because
sure.
like we kind of refer everything back to our own cognitive structure, and it's like we can't, because we make things, we think that things had to have been made by something that has like, the sort of intentionality or whatever that we do. But like, we make things in imitation of what's been going on all around us. Like the things that enabled humans to make watches are the very forces that are, at work in the natural world that we are of. That we are, a part of. There's always this tendency to separate ourselves, and therefore we feel that the watchmaker needs to be this separate being from the watch and from us and from everything. And it's just really kind of drab and circular thinking.
Right.
It's like, well, we make watches, therefore there must be some guy, some big guy.
For sure.
Really large.
Watches are complicated. I do have to say, I was and still am a big fan of Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, and I feel like they were fundamental in the construction of spirituality as it has sort of come to evolve in my life. Where
that's interesting because Dawkins really scoffs at spirituality.
I know. So did Christopher Hitchens.
He's a brilliant scientist for sure.
But I think coming from my upbringing, which was definitely Protestant and Southern in nature,
okay.
Their perspective was essential for me to start tearing down that version of God. And from that empty space, I always kind of joke that that Christopher Hitchens taught me not to be afraid of that God because it's not real. And then Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan, came and said, and you don't need to fear that God because you're God. And then Ram Dass came in and said, and so is everyone else.
Right.
And,
nice.
And then it kind of like unfolded into that.
That's so a nice organic progression.
Yeah, each one was necessary for the other one to make any sort of sense.
Yeah, I can dig that. I think that we are all kind of, in this culture, we're kind of held hostage by Judeo-Christian beliefs,
for sure,
and philosophy. And morality. So sometimes it takes a sledgehammer to free oneself from that sort of machine,
Yeah.
I remember when I first started to question it, just meeting like kids at school whose parents were scientists and they were atheists. And I was like, at first I was really like hurt that they didn't believe there was a God, but my parents weren't religious, but it was always just kind of like, yeah, there is one, and that was about it. We didn't talk about it or anything, but there was one. And then these kids would suggest there wasn't, and I would be like, how can you believe that? You're in such danger, And they'd be like, no, it's just, So I thought, when I approached my mom about Santa Claus, she admitted it. So I tried this. I tried the same thing with God, and she was like, well, this isn't like that. I actually do think there's one, but I don't really know. And so then I just kind of, for me, it was like William Blake and the Marriage of Heaven and Hell that really began to liberate me from that, and the work of Tom Robbins and then Alan Watts after that, which was kind of my first introduction to Zen and Buddhism. And I had some interesting kind of adjacent to some of your influences there, like not Anton LaVey himself, but Robert Anton Wilson, who wrote a lot about kind of occult figures, and he kind of helped me smash that framework too. And fortunately, because it wasn't really inculcated by my parents, it wasn't that hard to start seeing that it didn't make a lot of sense, and that most people, now don't get me wrong, I think that the life of Christ as a spiritual example makes all the sense. I think it's a beautiful story. I just don't think that most Christians really believe it.
Right.
They believe there was a guy, and for some reason they're entirely fixated on his grisly demise, but they don't. All the stuff that he spent his entire life saying and doing kind of goes out the window.
Yeah.
It's like all this stuff about love and charity and the least of my brothers and all that doesn't really work so well within like a capitalist modern framework. Right. So it doesn't really make it into the into the club these days.
It's only confusing if you try to shoehorn it into the way that you already view the world.
Yeah.
Then if you actually, I've kind of been really enjoying diving back into parts of the Bible, in particular the Gospel. And
I love the Sermon on the Mount. I think it's one of the most beautiful.
I love it.
One of the most beautiful pieces of spiritual literature and teaching.
I always love
it's poetry.
Anytime I see it, I save it and send it to someone. But it's like a comic made out of 80s or 90s painting of the Sermon on the Mount. Of course, everybody's white, and there's a speech bubble, and Jesus says, love your neighbor. And then there's a bunch of speech bubbles from the crowd that says like, what if he's gay? What if he's black?
Yeah.
And Jesus says, I'm going to start over and you let me know where I lose you. But yeah, I've really, it's almost been frustrating to sort of dive back in and see like, why didn't I get any of this from the pulpit?
Yeah. No, and I know that's not, I don't want to over apply that, because there are people that I know who are Christian who are actually practicing
for sure.
Who are very much living those teachings, like some of my nurse colleagues at hospice come to mind, they have a faith and a spirituality that is very clearly genuine, and they are enacting, the life of Christ by ministering to suffering people and enacting compassion for their fellow humans and they're loving people, and I know people from all walks of life who, not as many rich people, I should say. But then again, funny. I don't really know any either. Not too many.
That's true.
I know people who are rich compared to me, but
right.
It seems like that whole thing that Jesus said about how it was easier for a rich man for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into heaven. I think there's something there that would be well heeded, but it isn't generally.
Yeah.
But I won't make this like some sort of anti-capitalist diatribe either.
Right.
I know that's not what we're aiming at.
There will be plenty to extrapolate and put your own lens on. You're going to do that anyway. So that actually is sort of a nice segue. I'm going to jump ahead. The people that tend to do the work, capital T, capital W, and live that kind of message. Part of that message is doing so meekly and quietly and not for any sort of personal gain or self-celebration. We talked about this prior to recording, that you've been doing work quietly, and I was nervous about wanting to talk about it on the podcast, but in the last show you wrote a song about performing for hospice patients and what that experience has been like. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that. Where did it come from? The thought to do that, and how has it changed your perspective on death and dying?
Yeah, well, I started doing it after my diagnosis a couple of years ago, which I really can't overstate the major shift that represents for me spiritually, and just the whole trajectory of my life shifted. And that's probably not hard for people to imagine, because most people, I think would view a cancer diagnosis as being a pretty life-changing thing, but maybe not in the way you think, and it might surprise people to learn that I've had access to much more peace and happiness since then. And I think as a direct result of that, now, I mean, if the cancer wants to fuck off now, that's cool. I promise not to forget the teaching, but it really opened me up spiritually in my spiritual practice, which, I won't kind of elaborate too much more on that than seems necessary.
Oh, you will. We'll get to it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to talk about it in its proper place, but I try to be conscious of not over talking about it, not being one of those people who
being one of those
people. Yeah. But anyway, this growing spiritual awareness, in Buddhism they often call it the way-seeking mind. It awakens the way-seeking mind. Something will happen that will it kind of awaken this natural curiosity, this kind of seeking, and this desire to step on the path. And so, my meditation practice began to deepen then, and I believe it was Ram Dass actually that I got the idea directly from. My father passed away in hospice 10 years ago now. And I was a wreck, I was still an alcoholic at the time, and I was chain smoking. I was able to be there to hold his hand, but I can't say much more for myself. Besides that, he boasted to all the nurses that he met about what great musicians his sons were, and yet I didn't have the presence of mind to bring my guitar and play for him. I don't know why I didn't think of that. I give myself a break because, it's hard to watch your dad die. And it's hard to be an alcoholic, and to do those things at the same time is like some kind of complicated emotional math. So
I've never thought about that. Just to interject real quick about like it was hard being an alcoholic.
Oh yeah, it's soul crushing. It's soul crushing.
Two ex drunks in a room together, and I've never just like distilled it down into that. Like that was fucking difficult keeping that shit up.
It's dark and it's hard. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Please continue.
No, but so I always wished I'd when I thought of someone like that close to me dying, I imagined myself showing up like strewing flowers and uplifting philosophy about the room, and that's not how it went down. It's all I could do to just kind of be there and be a wreck and hold his hand. And so, that was kind of that lingering regret. And then one night after my diagnosis, this is years later now, Kim and I were on the road somewhere. I think she was on tour with me, and we were in the van listening to a Ram Dass lecture. And, Ram Dass really liked to talk. He really didn't have any problem talking about his work with dying people. I don't know how many lectures he'd like, I work with dying people, as you may know. And of course you did, because he said a lot, not to disparage it, because I'm coming to why, I'm now willing to talk about that. But, I kind of like what was it, like one of those light bulb moments, and I was like, that's it. I was like, I want to work with dying people. And I said it to Kim. I was like, I could play for people who are dying. I could like do what I didn't do for my dad. And she said, I think it's a wonderful idea. So I got home from the tour, and I put a post out on Facebook, and I said, hey, I'm looking to offer some volunteer work with people who are in end of life care, and through that, through the hive mind, I was connected with a bunch of people at a few different centers, and I ended up taking the training with hospice and community care, one of only 2 nonprofit hospice organizations in our area. There are, I think, something like 25 of them, and only 2 of them are nonprofit. And I think that includes the one that's now merged with hospice. I think they're both now under hospice and community care. Don't quote me on that.
Okay.
But I took the training there, and it became clear immediately, just talking to the people and everything, that it was going to be the fit. And they hadn't had what they call a music support volunteer in some years. They have a music therapist they employ. It's just her and she, and then there's a chaplain who plays the harmonica, so he's part of that vibe too. But this music therapist, she can only be in so many places at once, and I think she works a lot with the home hospice patients. So they were happy to have a musician, on board again, and it just became such a powerful part of my life so quickly. And initially, as you mentioned, I didn't want to talk about it publicly, because every time I would mention it to someone, people would say, "Oh, wow, that's so nice of you. You're such a good guy," And as I said when I introduced that song, I don't really think it's so nice of me. I think it's so nice of them to allow a person they've never met into something as intimate as their dying,
Right.
The family members who are there, an incredible amount of trust is involved, that I'm going to come in and just not suck. I think it's like, it's almost certainly the last live performance their loved one is ever going to hear, or that they're, often it's the patients themselves who I'm talking with, because, sometimes they're responsive, sometimes they're not. It depends on where they are in their process. But it's such a privilege to be allowed into someone's life in that way. I think if you're a musician or a performer, and you get to attend people in times of birth or union or dying, or all these important intimate times of people's lives, that's like the real work. That's the good stuff. Like people are really letting you into their hearts and their lives. And so it's such a privilege. And I came to feel, though, that talking about it might help to normalize it, because one of the things that gave birth to the hospice movement, I think, and that still kind of motivates it, is our kind of habitual squeamishness about death in this culture.
Yeah.
Not all cultures are like this. I sat across a riverbank in Kathmandu once and watched a funeral procession make its way through town with horns and colors and fanfare, and they came down to the riverbank to the funeral ghats, and I watched the sons burning the bodies of their own fathers, and I thought back to watching, to saying goodbye to my dad in that bed in hospice, and then I just left, and some funeral company came in and took him away, and I didn't see him again until he was neatly ashes in an urn. These guys sitting there were feeding the fires under their father's body. There's this beautiful intimacy about that, and it felt right. It was like, this is, there's this celebratory kind of parade atmosphere, and then there's just like, this is my work to do, to burn the body. And hospice, I feel like it gives people that dignity, and that, like, no, you'll go in there and nobody is treating these people like pitiable beings. Yeah. They're kind, they're laughing with them, they're singing to them. The nurses will hold someone's hand and sing with me as I sing to them and serenade them, and like they'll dance them around, they'll dance their arms around, and like, it's just these wonderful, compassionate people who are helping provide a space of peace and dignity for people to die in, rather than being in a hospital with beeping, blipping machinery. And we've all been,
God forbid, the back of an ambulance.
Yeah. Or
don't die in the back of an ambulance.
If I can help it,
it's not fun for anybody.
It might not be my call to make, but
I'm not saying for you, like for the as a courtesy, try not to die.
In
the truck
for the sake of the drivers too. The hospice people are ready for it. So.
For sure.
I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and it's become like a community for me. Both the community of people who come and go, and also the nurses and the staff and all the, they really feel like a branch of my extended family now. And so I started talking about it and singing about it, in hopes that these conversations will become a little bit more natural for us to have, because, death shouldn't be something that we're so squeamish about, given that it's something that every living thing will, it's a gate that we'll all pass through. And there's a lot of actually there's a lot of kind of uplift to be found in talking about it. It's another reason I'm grateful for, the spiritual traditions that don't push it aside, because, like in Zen, the branch of Buddhism that I practice, and it's made a point of, we call it the great matter, death and life, and it's discussing the great matter, and there's a lot of practice that's designed to bring your attention to it repeatedly, and the imminence of it, and that's not to be morbid, it's to awaken you to your life, so I think there's value in that too.
Do you think that aspect is something that drew you to Zen in particular?
Yes, for sure.
Hard yes.
There's a lot of things that did. The kind of poetic quality of it, Zen has roots in Taoist nature mysticism from China, so there's a lot of I'm a naturophile for sure. I'm out on a trail every day. One of the things we love about our home here on the Susquehanna is that we can watch the birds outside the windows on the river playing and flying and fishing, and watch the seasons change and everything. So the natural world has been central to my spirituality even before I had any idea what to call it. Not that I do now, but before there was any kind of practice or anything, just that sense of, I feel like we all have some sort of sense of our connection to things that we might call spirituality if we're so inclined. And that's always been important to me. So there's that aspect of it. There's the sort of embrace of paradox and contradiction that just seems to jive with a way that I've always held the world in mind and didn't really know how to describe, and thought it was just fuzzy or wishy-washy thinking on my part that just ends up being kind of this recognition of the interdependence of things and the limitations of concepts themselves, because Zen is very much about sort of letting go of the concepts, and it's very much about experience. It's a very experiential kind of craft. So there's a lot of things that drew me to it. I've been interested in it since I was very, very young.
Okay,
but didn't really, I don't think, understand, and still don't, because if you think you do, you might not be doing it right.
Right.
I mean, maybe some of my teachers, I don't even think they would say that. In fact, there's a principle that's very dearly held in Zen called don't know mind, or beginner's mind. You embrace not knowing, and that's kind of the beginning of the practice, and also the advanced stages of the practice.
Right. Yeah. I think my experience with Zen Buddhism, or spirituality in general, I'm a bit of a content tourist.
I love so many traditions too. They're like different flavors, and
and they seem each one seems sort of poised to offer just what you may need in certain differing circumstances.
Absolutely.
But like you said, in Zen, with the tradition of paradox and embracing paradox, it seems to fly in the face of what we as a Western society, a Western culture, sort of value. And we celebrate someone who is very clear and concise and hardline. Our politicians, we love when someone has felt a certain way and has always felt a certain way and has never deviated from that certain way. Whereas the opposite of that is being like, no, it actually is not. Maybe it is important to acknowledge that it is not one certain way. There's all these false dichotomies that it is either one way or another. No, sometimes it's neither and both at the same time.
That's I was a logic tutor in my philosophy days of college, because I said linguistics, but I actually also had a degree in philosophy. And
we get it. You're cultured.
So deeply cultured. What you're really getting from that is that I'll be in debt until I'm in my grave. That's what my college education means. Because I went just for the old-fashioned reason of wanting to enrich myself mentally.
For sure.
Not because I wanted to get a job, but I tutored logic, and that is very much how kind of like the Western logical framework. It's like the rules say it's either A or not A, right?
Yeah,
and so it can't be. But then like Mahayana Buddhism comes along and says it's A and not A, and both A and not A, and neither A nor not A. And those things are all true, and it just makes the kind of rationalist head to explode.
Yeah.
But, maybe that's something that attracted me, though, because as somebody who tended towards being hyper analytical and extremely language oriented, it's challenging to, and, of course, I don't know a spiritual tradition that demands that you abdicate your ability to think logically or anything. It's just like that you view that as the tool that it is, and not an actual correspondence with reality.
Good servant, lousy master.
Exactly. Yeah, I love that quote too. I don't even know who it's from.
I always think of it in Alan Watts' voice, but I know that that's not an original Alan Watts-ism.
Yeah, maybe that's what
I say. A little bit about, sort of getting into the minutia of Zen Buddhism. Do you think that, well, first off, would you consider yourself a Zen Buddhist?
I would say that I practice. I'm a practitioner of Zen. Yeah, and I do consider myself a Buddhist, but like, it's my teacher once said, like, the great thing about Buddhism is that you don't have to be a Buddhist to practice it. So it's like, in Zen particularly, these distinctions are held very lightly. Like if I identify like I am a Buddhist, I've already started to deviate from the path.
Yeah,
right? Because I'm making something mine. I'm identifying with it. But it's definitely true to say that I have a formal Zen practice in a traditional lineage of Zen Buddhism. Gotcha. With a teacher and a sangha and ceremonies and all that stuff. So yeah, I do practice.
Do you think that has been helpful? Even using the word helpful seems wrong or too constructed, but do you value having
centralized around a particular practice or doctrine, albeit one that tends to sort of shun practice and doctrine and dogma.
We don't shun practice, but definitely doctrine. Yeah, there's Zen.
There's plenty of practice.
You can find Zen koans and stuff that'll basically tell you to wipe your ass with the sutras and the spiritual texts. But it has become right for me. I think I was always very eclectic, and in fact, in my younger days, I was opposed to affiliation of any kind spiritually. I've been reading Zen and Taoist and Hindu and many other texts all my life, and learning and being enriched by the stories and edified by them. But I never had any desire to affiliate, and that became something that was the right path for me, and it kind of unfolded naturally. It wasn't that I thought my life is lacking something, I need to find a spiritual discipline and a teacher to practice it. No, it was more just as this spiritual curiosity deepened and deepened after my medical diagnosis, and I was practicing more and more. I was practicing with some different, I sat with a yoga teacher, a Swamini in a Hindu lineage, and I did some coursework with her, and I was listening to a lot of different spiritual teachers because there's so much Dharma teaching available on different apps and stuff these days, and I think that's a great use of a technology that can often do the opposite thing to our attention.
Yeah,
and, usually does. And it kind of happened that I didn't even search out and say oh, it's going to be Zen. I started to feel like the Buddhist teachings were home, and then I came upon my Sangha, this local practice group in this Zen lineage, and they became, my spiritual family, and I kind of just settled into the practice. It's just kind of it happened organically, I guess.
Yeah.
It's not like it's time to go adopt a dog and get a spiritual practice,
become a Buddhist,
buy a new suit. It's no, it just that's just where. Just like a lot of other things, you're not looking for a romantic relationship, but then you meet someone and one thing leads to another. Yeah. It was more like that, I would say.
I think that's an interesting point, that all the real things that tend to last are the ones that you had no intention of doing.
Yeah, and there's a great emphasis in Buddhism. They say the three treasures are Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So it's the Buddha is all of our awakened mind. The Dharma is the teachings and the path, and the Sangha is the community, So and for me, it really has proven to be true that community has been incredibly supportive to my life and practice. So it's something that I never viewed as being important, that once it showed up, I realized how critical and essential it is to me. Yeah.
The genuine ignorance, is satsang and sangha interchangeable?
I believe that satsang is I think that's just the Hindu version of that.
Okay.
It's like spiritual community, spiritual circle. I think they mean, I might be ignorant about it too, but I'm fairly certain that they do.
I'm sure I am.
They mean they mean basically the same thing. Yeah. I'm not sure what the different etymology of the words is.
As we've talked about, I've been hanging out with Quakers on Sunday, and
nice.
I think
good folks.
Quite. I think they're known for being just good. Them some good folks.
I know at least one of the members of our Sangha sits with Quakers too.
There's
close to meetings.
There's a very Buddhist element to Quakerism, or at least Foxian Quakerism, which is the only Quakerism that I've been exposed to.
Well, and Zen particularly, it should be said, is not really religiously exclusive. There are high level Zen teachers who are also Jesuit priests,
for sure,
in our region, and so they're Catholic nuns who are also Zen teachers. So it doesn't because Zen is a non-theistic spiritual practice. It's and people don't even agree on whether it's a religion or a practice or a spiritual
angle.
tradition or what. Different people will give different answers about that.
For sure. You introduced one one of your songs, Killing Snakes.
Yeah.
You told a story about your dad, sort of circling back to your dad a little bit.
Yeah.
And you said that you said that he told you that you were going about life like you were killing snakes, and that is to say, I think your quote was is to say, quickly and without finesse.
Yeah, hastily and
without finesse.
Yeah. My mom told me later after that song came out, she said that actually my father had gotten that phrase from her father.
Oh shit!
Kind of funny. So it's
I like
traveled down the family.
Yeah,
I guess.
Generational.
Yeah.
I love that song, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about not necessarily where that song is coming from, but where that song is coming from coming from, that sort of tendency as one graduates, to use that term rather poetically, to graduate into a season of life where it does become necessary and apparent to just slow down a little bit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Which is interesting because my father was actually one of the most tense. His second wife called his family genetically tense, and I think that's a fair description. So it was kind of funny for him to say that to me too.
Yeah.
He had a ferocious temper, and he was also very tense. So he might have been guilty of what he was. Guilty is the wrong word. It's not a trial. He might have also, maybe that's why he recognized it, and that it was something that was maybe detrimental to me. That song really is about the way that relationships continue to deepen after one of the, I don't know about both, that's an experience I haven't had yet, but after one of the parties has died. When he died, my friend Mark said to me, I think you'll be surprised at what a big part of your life he continues to be, because his father had died when he was probably around my age, and that really turned out to be true in a more profound way than I could have anticipated. And particularly with kind of spiritual practice, you start coming to terms with different aspects of yourself that have been challenging to face. And when those aspects have traveled down through generations of kin, you start to feel like you're practicing with and for everyone in a way, So like my dad had this, he was kind of what you might call a rageaholic, and he could be a bit violent and, in a number of ways, sometimes physically and sometimes just, emotionally,
in the purest
and screaming
sense
and
of the word. Yeah.
But one of the ways that our relationship has become more complex and subtle is that I just really recognize so many of his tendencies in me, and realize that it's not personal, like it came down to me through him, and it came down to him through somewhere. And this violence and this anger has been traveling for, we might say beginningless time, from whatever source of aggression it came down from. And so that song I wrote in this room on what would have been his 78th birthday. And, Kim was out doing something or other. So I was home alone just with the dogs. And I remember I sat here for hours and just like tried to have this conversation with him that became the song. And it is in that form, like I'm speaking to him in the song. And, I mentioned our kind of shared reactivity and anger in it. I say, your face goes red my face goes red the way yours used to get. And so it was kind of like working that out, kind of how this relationship continues to change. I remember, not to overly bring up Thich Nhat Hanh, but he's said so many beautiful things. And I listened to a talk by him.
Your last one.
Yeah. Yeah. Flag me on it. That made me cry, because he was saying, like we can, you can practice with your parents and your ancestors, and you can transform these qualities for all of, you can help them even if they're gone, and you can work towards transforming, you can say like, I'm going to practice for us. So I started doing that, when I would be sitting or something, I would kind of invite my dad to sit with me, and so that song is kind of like it kind of grows from that. And the first time I played it, I remember I played it in this little listening room, and I talked a little bit about it, not this much, but a little bit. And somebody came up to me afterwards and said, my dad died last year, and I really, I've been struggling to come to terms with it. And that song, I really connected with it. So that's always what I'm hoping to do with a song. Like, I feel like if it's not of use to anyone but me, then that might be a little too narrow a window. Yeah. I really want them to be I really want my songs to be useful to other people.
For sure.
In some way. And I feel like, with any family member who we've had some kind of complex relationship with, and maybe they've gone beyond now, and we're working out the implications of that. I think it's worth sticking with that process and really continuing to be with the relationship after they're gone, rather than just kind of holding trauma or holding hurt or just glossing over that and only holding the positive memories, just kind of holding them as a complex human being, just like you, who was capable of bringing pain to others and suffering themselves or bringing joy and experiencing joy. Yeah.
I think that's a very poignant distinction to make between a practice for self-betterment. It's like, I think we might have talked about it before, where if you go sit on your cushion and think like, well, I'm gonna meditate now, and I'm gonna meditate so that I become a better person, or I'm gonna meditate so that I get these these cities, or if it's ego driven, then you're already kind of coming at it from the wrong place. Yeah. But if you treat it like your ego isn't something to be overcome and destroyed or something like that, it's something to be invited, just as you're sort of inviting your dad to sit with you in those moments, to invite the entirety of existence and life itself to, like, hey, let's pause for a second, let's have a sit, and let's do this from a place of, like, the collective betterment of everyone. Shouldn't we all be sort of working towards that? I can't imagine that's something that would be controversial in any way, shape, or form, but rest assured it will be.
That's always kind of the aim broadly, and like in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions is that you're practicing for the benefit of all beings, and that's explicitly stated. Like, you dedicate the merit of this practice to all beings, and it's also said in the teachings that when you sit, the entire everything sits with you, like everything is practicing with you. And that's the kind of stuff that can just sound like some really cryptic shit until you kind of get into the until you kind of make it experiential, it's so that's why I don't go around laying that stuff on, unless we're having like this, where we're having a conversation about these kinds of topics. I don't just go around laying that stuff on people like, well, the Buddha said, it's like, you don't want to be like an evangelist. That's not compatible with Buddhist practice, like that I know some Christians feel that that's something that they should be called to do. I'm not so sure about that myself. Yeah. But
that's one of my favorite Jesus-isms, is talking about casting pearls before swine. Mm-hmm. That, like, don't do that. You're wasting your time. You're wasting their time. You're going to leave a bad taste in their mouth. Let it happen. Just live it. And
there was a hospice patient who I really formed a bond with. At least I felt that way. And this person had a friend who came in when they were dying and decided that the time had come to evangelize and save this person's soul before they died. And the patient was really hurt by this, because this person just came in without, of all the ways that they might have brought comfort to their dying friend, just sitting with them, talking with them, listening to their stories, whatever it was, just sitting with someone can be so powerful, and just bearing witness to their suffering. This person, and to like be charitable, I understand that this person probably thought that they were doing the critical work of saving this patient's soul before they died. Like, they're like knocking on the doors of hell, and you got to go swoop in and get. But to me, that's such a misguided and kind of violent form of spirituality.
Yeah,
because it caused this person suffering. It didn't help relieve the suffering. It caused the suffering, and
kind of makes you think what do you think you're doing when you do that?
And do you really I do have to wonder if it really comes from a place of good intentions, or if it's more of an egoic thing.
Yeah.
You know, like this is my work to, you know, I have to do this for this person. You know,
Don't you dare die on me before I get to tell you about, you know, the Caucasian conservative Jesus. Don't you?
Yeah, exactly.
Don't you dare.
You will see your reflection in his gleaming white skin, and you will know that you have sinned.
Do you? I realize that this speculation doesn't necessarily matter as much as a lot of people think it does, but do you have an idea of what happens after one dies?
No, not at all. I mean, I think of like every morning I wake up and, you know, the sun is maybe just starting to come up or maybe not quite yet. And I'm coming from some sort of world that had been constructed by my mind in those dreams. And I wake up and it's like, oh, no, this, right?
Yeah.
Imagine the number of variations of that are possible.
Yeah.
You know? Like you could wake up into something else. And here's something interesting, though, and it was actually like a very scientific-minded materialist philosopher who came up with this notion, and not like some spiritual teacher. But he talked about how because subjectivity is, you know, basically without content, like our sense of being awake, our sense of just like existing, you know, everything else could be said to be like contents of awareness, right? There's just the awareness, and then there's like all the qualia, you know, the thoughts, the feelings of those sites.
It's one of my favorite words, by the way. Qualia.
Qualia, me too.
That's good.
Can't believe I just got to drop that shit. But so there's that. You know, he said, you know, we might look forward after death to just the sense of always having been, because like subjectivity is always going to be. It's just like that subjectivity will no longer contain the personal narrative of Leo DiSanto.
Yeah.
It will be somebody else's personal narrative, right? But like, is it really different subjectivity? Is it really like different consciousness? Or is it just that like what I call my life and my story are what reality is conscious of in this particular space-time area, you know? So that's one way that I think about it, but I have no idea what to say. I really love, you know, if you ever heard Ram Dass's bit with Emmanuel where he says, Ram Dass, dying is like taking off a tight shoe.
I love that.
I do tend to feel like it's some sort of liberation. That's my instinct. It's some sort of liberation, because we really are bound up in these selves that we believe that we are, you know, like this is my life. This is happening to me. Right.
Yeah.
I liked something you said to me once. I actually used it in a line in a song that I don't ever play, but like the world is happening to you.
Yeah.
You know, right.
You have no idea how, like, I think about that. I've choked myself up thinking about, like, Leo DiSanto used something that I said from a conversation.
It was such a great,
it
was such a beautifully descriptive line, because that is the way that we feel, right?
Yeah.
Like it's when some circumstance in the world that actually has nothing to do with us, like a traffic jam, let's say, or whatever, or like a political policy, when it causes us suffering, it's like it happened to us, you know, like it's just that we have this particular trajectory we think we're on, and we think this is me, this is not me over here. This over here is me. These things happening. This set of things is not me. This stuff is mine. That stuff is not mine. Therefore, like when so we put ourselves in this very narrow range of all the phenomenon that we're actually experiencing, you know, like I can see that guitar on the wall. Well, that's not me. This leg I can see, that is me.
Yeah.
And then when things happen within that narrow range that don't kind of go according to plan, we suffer a lot because of it. And spiritual practice involves kind of starting to open that aperture up to view yourself in a wider and more inclusive sense. So I feel like death would have to be the ultimate version of that, right? Like you are forced to just completely let go of this thing that you feel that you've invested all your. I remember when I got my diagnosis. This is kind of jumping around here, but it's on the topic. I remember this weird thought that came to me about that kind of described how I was feeling about it during the brief period that because I you know, it seems like, oh, I got this diagnosis, and then like, oh, spirituality started, and it was all lovely. No, the first night was like the worst night of my life when I was lying in the hospital, like basically kissing my life goodbye as I knew it. You know, it was very painful. I suffered quite a lot, mentally and emotionally. And I remember thinking like of my life as this devalued piece of currency, like, oh, well, that stock just dropped dramatically.
Yeah.
And then I remember like noticing that thought and thinking,
just
what
a little
fucking weird way to think about my life.
You're
right?
just a little Deutschmark in the Euro world.
And now it's like worth nothing, and the yen is up or whatever. You know, like everybody else that walked in, the doctors and the nurses, they were all yen, and I was like this poor devalued little piece of like shit coin or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, and I feel like that is like we have this kind of sunken cost fallacy with our lives, and we kind of think. One teacher said something like, we tend to think of our experiences as these little beads, you know, and we're this string that they're all strung on. Like, this is my life and my life experiences, rather than just that things are arising and then passing away, arising and then passing away, including all of our thoughts, all of our feelings, all of the different qualities, you know, that we have. So when I think about death, I really do. I love that tight shoe. I feel like it's got to be some sort of liberation, you know. And some people, more scientifically minded people, will say that's not the case. Like it's just nothing. Nothing happens after you die. And I say,
sounds pretty great.
And that's my instinct too. I'm like, oh, tell me more about this nothing. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
Like, what is that like? You know, is that the nothing from which all some things come?
Yeah,
because that's where we were before, right? So you know, that's kind of like the, you know, and one of the things I like about Buddhism is this steadfast refusal to say anything about what that is. You know, it's just he'll say like the Buddha said, like there is an unborn and unmade, you know, he'll talk about what it's not, which is anything, but not about what it is. Cause like whenever anyone tried to pin the Buddha down on his teachings, like what happens after you die, was that he'd say, I teach two things: suffering and the end of suffering. You know, that's my shtick. You gotta go talk to that guy up on the hill if you want to hear about what happens after you die.
I, however, am not the Buddha, and I love thinking about that shit.
Oh, I do too. I'm sure he thought about it. I'm sure he, you know, he probably saw it, but like.
So I dropped. It was a combination of things that sort of culminated to this idea that ultimately is nothing more than the thought experiment, but. Have you heard of or listened to the telepathy tapes?
No.
So it's 10 of 10 recommend. It's about people with autism communicating with their parents telepathically. Wow. and it's set up in such a way that apparently does not meet the standards of scientific experimentation. What's that?
Yeah, sure. Like a controlled trial type situation.
But there's hours and hours and hours of recordings and video of, you know, setting up these experiments where the kid could not possibly know what mom is looking at or drawing or writing or thinking, but they know. So I was listening to this with my partner, and I started thinking about the implications of perception not being linked to this, you know, 2.5 pounds of electric jelly between my ears, and
the dog's breakfast, as Vonnegut said.
The dog, yeah,
he called it 2.5 pounds of dog's breakfast.
I love it. So if perception is not tied to this physical self, then that means that consciousness is also not tied to a physical self and exists outside of the physical self, and so that means that the death of the physical self has no bearing on perception and continuity of consciousness.
That's what the Tibetans believe.
Right. So then that sort of started to play into the bardo, and how ultimately, if you think about like what actually would happen if I continued to be aware, but I wasn't controlling anything. I wasn't stuck inside of this trip.
Yeah, what would you be aware as, right?
Right. Yeah, it's not just aware of, aware as.
But, you know, that's an interesting thing to ask yourself in general, like if you're, you know, particularly if you're prone to sitting quietly for long periods of time, you know, like, you know, that's often kind of a pointing out instruction in meditation. In fact, it's like, what is it that's aware?
Yeah.
And, you know, and you can say, well, it's me, you know, I'm over here, it's my body.
My senses.
But then your body is the sensation of your body, and the sight of your body and whatever are things that you're aware of. So then you can ask yourself again, like, what is it that is aware of it?
Yeah.
You know, and you can get, you know, I feel like that question becomes very interesting to contemplate.
For sure.
You know.
Excuse me. And the last sort of implication that came with playing out that script of a thought experiment was that if you haven't thought about these things, if you're the type of person that spends every minute of your living life terrified of this thing that's going to happen, that is going to happen. Reminder to the listener, you are going to die.
Yes.
Then that experience would be pretty unpleasant, and one might even describe that experience as hell-like, where your consciousness is attached to having a form and having a self and having an ego, and then you're ripped away from it and you're just grabbing at whatever you can. However, if you do orient yourself and point yourself or tune yourself to a level that is a sense of liberation, then that experience would be considered something heavenly.
Liberation.
Right? Yeah.
Well, that's why these spiritual traditions that are this inclined this way, there's always the instruction of not being attached to the body, not identifying with the body, not identifying with the personal narrative, because these are temporary things that are arising in your awareness. And in terms of consciousness and what it is and where it is, I find this fascinating because I do a lot of reading in the veins of kind of neuroscience and consciousness research and cognitive science. And I find this fascinating, and it's a problem that there's no solution for, and I don't think that's widely known. I was reading recently a really wonderful book about animal senses and the way different animals perceive the world, animals that can sense the Earth's magnetic fields and things like that, see colors we can't see, all these different strange senses, and how they create a different what the author calls Umwelt, a German word for kind of like, your world around you, your sphere of experience. And the author just really slipped in a complete scientific misstatement, I think it's probably kind of considered common knowledge, but it's not true, which is that he said, consciousness is not so much a matter of the kind of machinery, it's just the amount of processing power. And it's like, that is not proven. There is no idea. There are different theories, and they're very complicated and mathematical, like integrated information theory and such, about what might give rise to consciousness. But the mechanisms that give rise to consciousness in the human mind are an entire mystery to science.
Yeah.
And many scientists say they can't even conceive of what such an answer might look like. They look for what's called the neural correlates of consciousness, which is like what seems to be happening in your brain when you're seeing redness or something like that.
Yeah.
So like specific, again, back to qualia, right? Like when you're smelling
Twice
lilac.
in one conversation. Hell yeah.
Twice, yeah. Go for a triple crown or something. So there's some research into that, and scientists are somewhat confident that they can start to say, well, here's what's happening in your brain when you're experiencing redness. But in terms of anything that would point to why a processing system would need to have an experience of what it's like to be that system.
Yeah.
Most scientists can't even get their head around. Now, some scientists are the strictly physicalist, materialist camp, where they say, well, once we know enough about the brain, the problem will evaporate. It'll become obvious, like we'll know. And then there are others who say like, no, this is a deep mystery, and probably we can't really get behind it, because like we can't get behind consciousness. Everything that happens, all of our experiments, all of our thoughts and research happen in consciousness. You can't get outside of it. It's like the one thing we can be sure is real, and also that we can't see behind. You can't see the other side of it.
It's kind of like the same problem of trying to just describe nothingness.
Yeah.
It's like
you can't do it without reference to something else.
Yeah,
right?
we're inside somethingness, and so everything is going to be in relation to somethingness. And if it's in relation to somethingness, it's not nothingness.
So I think that's one of the more interesting, particularly when you start kind of really sitting with awareness in general, and kind of really trying. I don't want to say like studying it or looking at it, because you can't really do that, because it's what's looking,
right? Yeah.
It's the thing that's looking, but that's where the interesting part kind of begins,
Yeah.
So I find that fascinating to consider too, about death. The Tibetans have this whole complex kind of yoga of death where they talk about the breakdown of each of the different elements in the body. You know, the breath is the breakdown of air, and then the moisture goes out of the butt. And they go through this whole meditation. It's like, it's quite hair raising to listen to, you know, like they'll be like, now Roshi Joan Halifax has, the Zen teacher has a recorded meditation where she goes through all of this whole meditation, and she describes what's happening as you die. And it's quite, you know, like it's, if you are one of these people that's terrified of death, maybe don't start there, because it's you know, but it's
but if you like horror movies and that genre, it might be titillating.
I feel like if you really just are the inquisitive type, and you want to kind of have you really want to, you're really curious about the nature of your being and of being in general, then interrogating your own death is necessary. It's also necessary to avoid a lot of suffering, because, you know, we're constantly losing things. You know, we're going to lose everything. It's something that's necessary. So you can just put it out of your mind and wait for it to happen, and then like break down when it does, or you can start to look at it and say, you know, somehow we have to make this make sense. You know, somehow this has to be, or else you can just kind of say, it's funny. I read a book by the great biologist, Robert Sapolsky, who I love his work. He's great. It's a book. He's basically seeking to disprove that the idea of free will has any meaning whatsoever in the context of what we know about, you know, brains and biology. And I think he largely succeeds, although from like a spiritual perspective, you might say the question is misformulated to begin with. You know, like, what is the you that you're talking about that has free? If you are what we narrowly usually refer to as a self, then it probably doesn't have any free will. But if it's something larger, as many spiritual traditions would suggest, then the question becomes less cut and dry. But anyway, the way he brings it home, because he's a scientist, you know, and he just kind of materialist perspective, he says, you know, well, it's kind of depressing, but that's just kind of the way things are. So it's probably just best to keep a stiff upper lip about it. You know, it's like, and you know, so you could take that position. I think that's kind of a lot of sort of science, people who venerate science as a god are kind of forced into that position. Like, well, everything does die, and you know, that just kind of sucks, and it's depressing. And, or you can ask, like, but you know, this world is so beautiful to us, and that's why everything's so dear to us, and that's why we grieve when things die. So if the world is really so beautiful, and we have this trust in it that, you know, the system is so like this, whatever is happening here is so beautiful and elegant, then maybe we're looking at it wrong. You know, like maybe we're looking at death and impermanence wrong in a way that makes it
only
seem...
sucks to you.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, maybe, you know, maybe, and maybe there's, and maybe just like being sad isn't bad, and maybe like, you know, maybe grieving isn't bad, and you know.
I loved diving into Genesis and picking that apart with ultimately it was Daniel Quinn's Ishmael.
Oh yeah, that the gorilla book. I think I read that a long time ago.
I'm probably going to recommend it to every person I talk to in this context.
Well, I'll have to read. I think I read it at some point, but given how fuzzy my memory is, I'm probably due for a reread.
I've got a copy. Welcome.
I've destroyed a lot of gray matter in my time.
Yeah, same.
I often wonder what my brain would be like if I hadn't lived the way that I lived.
Yeah. What have I forgotten? But this idea of like, kind of how we said earlier that things are only confusing if you try to shoehorn it into the worldview that you already have. But the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is always difficult for me to say. I'm amazed I got it right that time.
There's a lot of like subordinate.
And like, why is that forbidden? Why was that a no-no? Why was it even there in the first place in the Garden of Eden? And ultimately, it does come down to this idea that if you have the knowledge of good and evil, that means that you're ascribing a good or a bad value to everything, and ultimately that's illusion. It's from your own perspective, and nothing is either good or bad. And that sounds a lot
like a Richard Rohr's take on that. He was talking about that. He was talking about how it's that was what the knowledge of good and evil was that you start to make those distinctions, those
Yeah.
discriminations between good and bad. And I feel like Buddhism handles this very elegantly with the concept of the two truths, the absolute truth and conventional truth, sometimes called ultimate reality and phenomenal reality. Because, otherwise people start to really bristle at such relativism, like, oh, how are you to say there's no such thing as good and bad? Raping kids is bad, and it's just objectively is. And it's like, yeah, I'm totally going to go along with you on that. Like, it objectively is. Like, in our world where there are people and things, like, yeah, that's bad.
Yeah,
like,
I just want to go ahead and say on the record that we both are fundamentally opposed to raping kids.
Totally, yeah, or anything,
Raping,
just raping in general. I'm not in favor of.
Not to
do
rape.
So, like, and the way that Buddhism handles that is that, in the absolute realm, there aren't even, individual things or phenomena or people. It's like,
right.
It's like an unborn realm of things of, the more I try to describe it, the less right I'll be, because it's the absolute realm. So
yeah.
in an absolute level, like, our phenomenal reality is born of such discriminations.
Yeah.
And within that context, it's right to say, certain things cause suffering and certain things relieve suffering, and it's right to recognize that and acknowledge that. And it's our work to try to relieve suffering. But when we realize that our truths are not ultimate truths, then we can hold them a little bit more lightly. And I think that can only be a good thing in terms of recognizing our perceptions as being fallible and our convictions as being sometimes misguided.
I got you. Yeah. I want to sort of dive into something I've noticed about you when you talk about your practice, that you very rarely use the word meditate or meditation in regards to your own practice. If you're talking about meditation as a practice, I've noticed you'll use it, but when you talk about your own practice, you'll say sitting or and I was wondering if you would tell us a little bit about what your actual practice looks like.
Sure.
Externally and internally.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, because the practice is everything you meet in a way, so like
right.
This conversation is a practice too. I'm trying to be aware of what my motivations are at all times.
Sure.
And
self-suspect at all times.
And, when you're talking, to really listen to what you're saying and not just think about what I want to say next, which is a kind of a normal conversational habit for me and a lot of other people.
I just think of Krishnamurti when he just is listening.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I love that guy's voice.
It's great.
But yeah, so I think of a lot of things as being practice, and that's one of the, I think, motivations behind using the term practice, because my whole life is a practice. It's fair to say that I feel like everything I do now, from the musicianship to being a partner to being a friend to being a dog owner, dog dad, let's say, because I don't feel like I own any creatures, takes root in that soil. But as far as the practice goes, in Zen meditate, that's one of the reasons I don't use the word meditation, I think, a lot, is because it kind of conjures a lot of different possible, very different techniques. But for a lot of people these days, I think it conjures kind of a basic mindfulness technique, maybe watching your breath. And people have a lot of misconceptions about that, like that they're supposed to stop their thoughts, which, let me know how that goes for you, first of all. Because, like, I once heard somebody say, like, brains secrete thoughts the way that, like, saliva glands secrete saliva or whatever, which is kind of true.
I like that.
But
it's just dripping in my head.
there is a particular style of meditation practice associated with Zen practice, and there's a few different ones in our lineage. Traditionally, these have been parts of different lineages, but or different schools of Zen, but our particular lineage kind of is a hybrid between the Soto and Rinzai traditions. So we do both koan work, which is sitting with like a short phrase that's usually makes no sense whatsoever to in an intellectual way. It's kind of usually often paradoxical or just very strange. And
is it safe to say that the sound? What is the sound of one hand clapping? Is
that
probably
is
the
one.
most
It's
recognizable one.
That is, and it's actually my teachers always very, very, very sternly insist that it's actually just what is the sound of one hand. The full koan is you've heard the sound of two hands clapping. What is the sound of one hand?
Okay.
So because I was always tempted to, things like this. And of course, I'm not, like the answers to the presentations, you'll sit with these things for a while until some sort of an insight occurs to you. And then you will present it to your teacher in such a way that they will recognize that you have understood, and you'll be given another koan. So that's one kind of practice that is done in Zen and that's done in our lineage. You can think of them, although it's not quite analogous, you can kind of think of them as riddles in a way.
Yeah.
Only the presentations are more often physical than verbal. But and then there's the practice of Zen meditation is called Zazen, which just means sitting meditation, and it's really just that. Like there's a lot of other traditions that have a lot of instructions, but in Zen, particularly Soto Zen, the main practice is called Shikantaza, and it means just sitting. And that basically is the instruction.
Yeah.
And it's not as simple as that. Like you'll be told pretty specifically what posture physically to sit in. And then the instruction from Zen Master Dogen, the kind of the founder of the Soto lineage, was think not thinking. So you'll get instructions like that. And usually there will be some kind of like breath counting practice to start because if you just try to just sit there, you're just going to think yourself off the cushion over and over and over again. So some stability of concentration is necessary to make it fly. But then basically what it is like, I've heard one teacher describe it as a subjectless, objectless meditation. So your eyes are open a little bit. You're letting everything in, but not focusing on anything. You're looking at the context of your experience rather than the content, right? So it's rather than like, what is happening? It's more like, where is it happening in a way?
Yeah.
That's kind
what
of
is it happening.
That's
to?
kind of like
is
the best. What's it? So you're just sitting in awareness. That was the instruction I basically received when I started practicing Zen. It's like, just sit in awareness, So for a beginner, that's going to be rough. So oftentimes you'll be started with like, count your breaths from 1 to 10, either on the in breath and the out breath, or just the out breath. Breathe in, breathe out 1, breathe in, breathe out 2, and then just keep going. If you lose your place, go back to 1. And then eventually, once you can kind of do that and stabilize your concentration, then you can do this practice of just sitting.
The first time I tried that, I got that instruction. Totally was not aware that it had any basis in any particular practice. It was just like, try sitting still and counting your breath 1 to 10. And then when you get to 10, start over. And I found myself going 27, 28. And then, I hit it. I was like, fuck. I can't even do this right.
Yeah. I think there was one Ram Dass lecture where he suggested counting to 27 and then back down.
Okay.
Because that's kind of a random number. So like you have to be fairly mindful to know that you have to stop at 27.
Sure. Okay.
Now, I've done different variations of this, and I think counting the breath is a fairly common kind of starter method.
Yeah.
My teacher called it, he talked about counting in and out breath, then just out breath, then just watching the breath, and then just sitting. And he referred to it as 2 training wheels, 1 training wheel, no training wheel, look ma, no hands. So those
I love that.
Those are the different stages as described by my teacher.
That's beautiful.
But eventually, there's a lot of different, like I've sat Vipassana retreats, which is more of like an old style, like Pali Buddhism sort, and they have a lot more specific instructions that they'll do. They'll take you through guided things. They'll ask you to pay attention to certain things. There's a lot of focus on different content, focus on the feeling tone of when something comes up. Does it feel positive, negative, or pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral?
Yeah.
So they'll have you looking at a lot of things. They're all designed for different purposes. And the Zen meditation, the shikantaza is very conducive to what is trying to be kind of cultivated in a non-cultivation type of way in Zen, So.
It's fundamentally difficult to talk about, and
it is, because that's just like you get that practice, and it's not a progressive thing. It's just like that's your practice.
Yeah,
you just keep doing that, and it unfolds. So that's most of my practice. I do koan work, although like our sangha doesn't require it. That you're kind of asked, like, do you have any interest in working on koans? Do you want to give it a try? Do you want to give it a try and then abandon it? Whatever. So some people, so some of our members do work on koans, and I've always been drawn to them. I always thought they were very interesting.
I think they're fascinating.
My current
frustrating as
koan is I love this one. It's outside an old Buddhist shrine, a dog is pissing towards heaven. That's my koan.
I love it. What's been the hardest thing to uproot? What's been the most entrenched thing about the ape Leo DiSanto that's been difficult for you?
It's all still there. It's none of it's been uprooted.
I appreciate that answer so much.
The early Buddhism talks a lot about uprooting the defilements and stuff, and according to that particular tradition, you are working towards getting to a point where these quote unquote unwholesome states of mind don't arise anymore. That seems kind of fantastical to me, and it's not actually a thing in my tradition that I practice in. So it's more like, and not every tradition is a little different on this. Like, are you actually like Zen is not a self-improvement project,
right?
One teacher said it's a self-destruction project. Like that.
Yeah.
But still, I don't think it's impossible to talk about this, though, because you do become much more aware of various tendencies. And, I mentioned kind of anger and reactivity is one that's a family jewel of mine. The Tibetan teacher, Sokni Rinpoche, has this great phrase. He calls these things beautiful monsters, you're kind of like your tragic flaws, if you will.
Yeah.
And he suggests that you befriend them, like they're there, befriend them. I used to think that if I practiced meditation enough, I would eventually stop yelling obscenities at inanimate objects in the middle of the day for no apparent reason. Now I'm fairly convinced, and it's not that I've been practicing for that long. I mean, like the spiritual traditions are full of people who've been practicing for longer than I've been alive. I mean, I think my teacher has been. But I kind of no longer think that that's going to happen. But weirdly and paradoxically, like the more that you start to notice, how Ram Dass used to say, like, all my neuroses are still there. They're just now these little schmoos, and I invite them in for tea.
Yeah.
It's a bit like that, you know? Like, I named the angry character Red-Faced Joe in honor of my dear departed dad. His name was Joe, so I'll be like, and like even like Kim knows him too. I'll be like, oh, Red-Faced Joe just kind of wanted to come out there a little bit there, and she's like, oh, you say hi to that guy, like just shake his hand, give him a hug. Like, these are all parts of who actually really turned me around on this was a teacher from the yoga, like the Vedic traditions, like the Hindu traditions. I was at a wisdom circle with her, and a very wise teacher who I've learned a lot from up in Reading. And she, we were in a wisdom circle talk, and we were doing like some questions, and I said something about, I was talking about like fear and anger, and I was saying something about, like that's not useful. So I'll just like ask fear and anger to just go stand outside the door and, whatever.
Yeah.
Imagine. And she said, Leo, how would you feel if you showed up to practice today? And I said, oh, Leo, thank you for coming. Could you go please wait outside? And I said, and that just kind of stopped my mind. I was like, oh yeah. Like you can't, the parts of us that we think of as being, that we're ashamed of, or, they're offensive to us in some way, or to other people, or they feel unhealthy. They are there nonetheless. And so it's like, what do they want? what might they have to teach? So trying to eradicate them, there's that old phrase, I don't know where it comes from, but that which you resist persists.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much of, but there's a real superpower in just becoming aware of this stuff. Like, oh, there's my temper starting to go. What's it like? Oh, it feels like this kind of metallic tension in my chest, and then maybe there's a burning here, and thoughts are coming. These stories, like, why did she do that? She doesn't respect. You start to notice all these things happening, and that gives you some freedom, right? There's a little space where you might be different in that moment. You might just take a breath and let that go.
Yeah,
and that is a real possibility. It becomes more and more possible. So I'm not sure how much can be done about what comes up. And though interestingly, though, just given the nature of the human mind and everything, the less that you do actually act on those reactions. It's like some old, Nick Fitter who just doesn't have that next cigarette, and then maybe he doesn't want a cigarette as bad the next time. Maybe there's not as bad of a craving the next time.
There is sort of an interesting distinction. I'm not even sure that you noticed that you did it, that you acknowledge you sort of change perspective, and instead of saying I am angry, you say there is anger.
No,
and that, in my experience, just those subtle, very two-dimensional methods of dealing with things that bubble up inside of me, to change that perspective and say, instead of saying I am angry and I'm pissed that I'm angry, just to call it what it is. There is anger. Describe it, and you're sort of pulling away that value.
This is mine.
Yeah, this is mine, and it is good or it is bad. It's just you're describing it.
Yeah,
which I think is
the Buddha said. This is to practice with the phrases. This is not me. This is not mine. This is not myself. With the things that come up, because really, why should the anger be you or yours? It's something that's arising in your experience.
Yeah.
Is the sunshine yours? Is the bird song yours? Sure, if you want. But,
we paid for it. We paid good money for it. And this is the sun that shines on God's favorite country.
Yeah, that's right. Clearly.
I could very legitimately do this all day. I do have to wrap it up. So
if we don't, the file's going to be just ungodly big.
I know.
Hopefully you will attract an audience that's interested in like a spiritual mamba jahamba, because otherwise although if you're listening to a podcast that is overtly about death, then explicitly about death, then I guess you would expect some.
Like I said, I would put that flag up right at the beginning to make sure that people know what they're getting into. You recently released your album To Fly So Low, recorded with our mutual friend Bobby Gentillo at Right Coast Recording Studio. Big shout out to Bobby. That's available on your website. That's available at your shows. You can buy it with cash monies
in a duct taped retail suitcase near you.
Absolutely,
at least it will be near you when I bring it there. And like all the best things in life can be bought from dodgy men in duct taped suitcases. It's really where the good stuff is.
And if and only if those avenues are not available to you, you can also find it wherever you stream your music. What's next? Is there anything that you're currently working on that you're excited about?
Yeah, I'm always writing songs, and I would, eventually, and I guess this falls into that category. We're hoping to. I don't want to say break ground, because we're using an existing area of already broken ground, but we're hoping to tear down our old shed this year before it gets too cold, and build up a 2-story structure the top of which will be my new recording studio.
Nice.
So I just want to make as many records as I can in however much time I have before I die, and because it just it brings me peace to do so, and keeps me interested. So I'm writing a lot of songs, trying to expand the range of things that I write about and approaches to it and ways that I do it. I'd like to do a live album sometime in the next year, because
cool.
Kind of developed a story with a lot of, or a show rather, with a lot of like stories and kind of back and forth with the crowd. I'd like to get that down, do that somewhere, and have somebody come out and record it. And
well, if you decide that for any part of that experience you want some very rusty harmonica or timid background vocals, hit me up.
Hell yeah. I'd like some harmonica lessons too. I'm never sure quite how I should practice. I practice my harmonicas and I'm like, I practice scales and stuff, but I feel like there's something I'm missing. So
I'm trying to remember who said it, and there's only a couple harmonica players that I pay attention enough to remember something that was said, but
is one of them Mickey Raphael?
Actually, no. It was a local guy. I know it was. Anyway, he said playing harmonica is easy. It's like riding roller skates in a hurricane, and I've sat with that. It's kind of become my own sort of koan that, like, I love it. The longer I play, I'm like, I guess this is sort of like riding roller skates in a hurricane. But yeah, it's I need to start doing that again, like actually playing music instead of just being a musician on paper only. So,
yeah, well, we're all things on paper when we're not doing that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Even if no one else ever listens to it, I really enjoyed the conversation.
I meant to extend a welcome in the beginning and tell you to make yourself at home, but yeah, we are in your home.
Yeah.
So thank you again for inviting me into your home, for having these conversations, both on and off mic, and I can't wait to do it again.
Yeah, anytime.
Thanks so much, man.
Yeah.
That was Leo DiSanto, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. You can find him at leodisanto.com or on Instagram at thisisleodisanto. I'll put links to all his pages in the description. If you haven't done so before, go check out his stuff. Buy an album. Go see him live. Tell him Aaron sent you. Tell him that you listened to him on the Get Better and Die Trying podcast. Tell him you love him. Tell him we love him. Support local music. Support each other. And let's do this again sometime. Thank you so much. Ram Ram, I love you.